This video is a historical reconstruction created with AI, based on period records, and produced for educational and narrative purposes.
For decades, it was believed that the interior of the Titanic had been completely destroyed. But the ship does not rest as a single piece on the ocean floor. It lies in two massive sections, torn apart in the final moments of the sinking. Between those wrecks, parts of the first-class interior still exist, sheltered from the full force of the collapse. Before we move into these submerged corridors, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's move forward slowly into one of the most luxurious spaces ever built at sea, and see what the ocean chose to preserve. The first-class corridors were designed to resemble Europe's finest hotels of the early 20th century. Carved wood panels lined the walls, serving both beauty and function, softening sound and absorbing vibration. Brass fittings signaled status, but also resisted moisture during long Atlantic crossings. When the ship sank, water entered unevenly, leaving visible tide marks on doors and floors. In some places, cabin numbers can still be identified, despite corrosion and layers of sediment. Every detail reveals how these spaces were slowly claimed by the ocean, without signs of sudden, violent impact. Stepping into a first-class cabin, the scale of the space becomes immediately clear. The bed, once elevated and solid, collapsed under the weight of water and time. The wash basin remains fixed to the wall, its porcelain stained by fine sediment. A mirror still catches the light of the ROV, but its surface is dull and uneven. Fabrics that once covered furniture and mattresses have broken down into loose fibers. Even so, the original layout of the room can still be recognized. Scattered across the cabin, small personal items reveal everyday habits abruptly interrupted. A hairbrush rests near the floor, its bristles warped by time. Glass bottles remain sealed, now clouded by mineral deposits. Gloves, once carefully stored, have lost their shape. Leather suitcases collapsed under pressure, yet their buckles still hold. These objects were not swept away by currents, showing that water entered this space slowly. Even after more than a century underwater, parts of the first-class structure still reflect its original luxury. Carved wooden panels remain attached to the walls, swollen and darkened by moisture. Decorative frames stay in place, spared from direct collapse. Brass handles and fittings resisted corrosion better than the surrounding steel. These details show how premium materials were chosen not just for beauty, but for durability. First-class hygiene areas reflected high standards of comfort for their time. Tiles still cover the walls, though many are cracked or displaced. Faucets made from resistant metal alloys remain in place, now coated in corrosion and mineral buildup. Porcelain pieces shattered under impact and pressure, scattering fragments across the floor. Even in decay, the layout reveals careful planning for daily use. water transformed these spaces of care into silent records of the sinking. Some first-class cabins were connected by internal doors, offering more privacy and space. These partitions still show how the rooms once worked together. When the ship sank, parts of the walls partially gave way, creating narrow openings between compartments. Wood swelled and warped. Metal lost its strength. The ROV moves carefully, avoiding sediment trapped in these fragile zones. These collapses show how destruction unfolded gradually inside the ship. The first-class flooring still reveals traces of its original finish. Carpets that once covered the corridors have turned into loose fibers mixed with sediment. In some places, decorative patterns can still be recognized. Constant exposure to water erased the original texture. What remains is a thin layer, like marine dust. Even so, the organization of the space is still readable. The lighting systems of first class now exist only as structure. Wall lamps remain attached, with no trace of function. Wiring is exposed in some areas, eaten away by salt water. Brass darkened over time, forming uneven layers of oxidation. Nothing here produces light or energy anymore. Everything now depends on the beams of the ROV. In some areas, drawers and cabinets remain partially open, revealing displaced objects inside. Nothing is arranged the way it once was. Light items shifted. Others became trapped by debris or sediment. Preservation is uneven, shaped by how water moved through each space. These groupings are not frozen moments, but the result of slow transformation. Every object stopped where the water allowed it to stop. Every detail recorded here is archaeological evidence in the process of disappearing. Bacteria, currents, and corrosion advance year after year. To document now is to preserve knowledge before it vanishes forever. These records help us understand not just the ship, but the era that built it. If this kind of exploration speaks to you, subscribe for future investigations. Time keeps working, even when no one is watching. The marks of the sinking are visible in the structure itself. Wood absorbed water and expanded, warping doors and panels. Metal hinges twisted under pressure and movement. Sediment built up thick in corners and joints. These signs point to areas where water remained longer. The space reveals how impact and flooding acted unevenly. Here, the level of finish reflects the peak of first-class luxury. Decoration is more elaborate, with deep carvings inspired by aristocratic homes. Decorative elements survived better, protected by thicker walls. The space clearly aimed for refinement and comfort. Even in decay, it still stands apart from the rest of the ship. This was the highest standard passengers could buy. In rare moments, the arrangement of the wreckage stirs the imagination. Among the remains of first-class luxury, a human figure appears, reduced to bones. The body rests beside a personal object, unusually preserved. This is not a literal record, but a symbolic representation of loss. The contrast between wealth and death becomes unavoidable. Moments later, the exploration returns to a scientific lens. After the visual contrast, observation returns to science. What remains here is matter, structure, and gradual decay. Wood, metal, and sediment follow clear patterns of deterioration. Nothing suggests intention or symbolic meaning. What we see are physical processes at work. This shift reminds us to separate human interpretation from material evidence. Among the most fragile materials inside the wreck, some artifacts are still recognizable. Glass lost its clarity and became extremely brittle. Paper did not survive as surface. Only faint traces remain in the sediment. Leather hardened and shrank, keeping part of its shape. Each material reacted differently to cold water and pressure. Together, they define the limits of underwater preservation. Navigating inside the wreck demands absolute control. One sudden movement can lift decades of sediment. When that happens, visibility disappears in seconds. The ROV advances slowly, adjusting buoyancy and direction at every turn. Routes avoid unstable surfaces. Exploration here is an exercise in caution. Biological rust dominates much of the ship's interior. Known as rusticles, these formations come from bacteria that feed on iron. They grow in fragile layers, like peeling bark. Over time, they break off and fall, speeding up structural loss. The process is constant and irreversible. The Titanic is being consumed from the inside out. This compartment was better shielded from direct water flow. Reduced circulation slowed material wear. Surfaces keep clearer shapes. Less sediment settled inside. Wood shows less deformation. Some details remain recognizable. These differences help researchers understand how water moved through the ship. Small variations shaped preservation in powerful ways. Remains of clothing can still be identified inside the wreck. Fabric lost its form, breaking into loose threads mixed with sediment. Buttons and buckles endured longer, clinging to what remains of the garments. Salt and bacteria completely altered these organic materials. What survives are only faint traces of everyday life, fragments that tell how bodies and matter faced the deep. Where surface panels have disappeared, the ship's inner structure is exposed. Wood and metal joints reveal precise construction methods. Interior rivets remain in place despite heavy corrosion. The craftsmanship shows a high level of industrial control for its time. These details explain the ship's initial strength. They also reveal the limits of engineering in the deep sea. Not every part of the wreck can be explored safely. Some passages are blocked by total structural collapse. Others risk giving way at the slightest touch. The ROV must respect these limits. Scientific exploration is not about pushing forward at all costs. Knowing when to stop is part of archaeology. Some interior elements are still easily recognizable. Doors, frames, and parts of furniture keep clear shapes despite heavy decay. They represent the final stages before total collapse. In time, even these references will vanish. What we recognize today may exist tomorrow only as sediment. To record them now is to record the edge of preservation. In this sequence, the interior is seen as a whole. The luxury that once defined first class now appears fragmented and corroded. Wood, metal, and decoration coexist in different stages of decay. There is no single focal point, only the sum of remnants. The space reveals what remains after more than a century underwater. Observation replaces emotional interpretation. Here, the cabin seems suspended in time. There is no movement, except drifting particles in the water. Objects rest where they finally settled after the sinking. Nothing suggests later activity or rearrangement. Silence dominates the space. These rooms mark the sudden end of life on board. Over the decades, time became the Titanic's greatest force. No structure remains unchanged here. Decay continues, slow and steady, with or without human presence. Scientific recording does not stop the process, but it preserves what knowledge it can. In the end, knowledge becomes the only form of permanence. The exploration comes to an end, but the wreck remains. The ROV's lights fade, returning the interior to deep darkness. Nothing here reacts to human presence. The Titanic answers only to time, pressure, and cold water. Silence settles back into its original state. The ship stays behind, while the record rises to the surface.